Finally, we get to war. When we look at the origins of World War I, it's worth stopping for a second to remember what an extraordinary scale World War I had. For Americans, it's worth remembering that the Vietnam War involved about 55,000 American dead. Or if you want a historical case, when Bismarck attacked Austria in the 1860s, about 36,000 dead. In a single battle, the Battle of the Somme in 1916, there were 1.3 million casualties. Just an extraordinary difference in the order of magnitude of this war. And that helps to explain some of the significance of World War I. It was indeed a world destroyed. World War I ended three empires: the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Russian Empire. It ushered in the Russian Revolution and communism and the ideologization of international politics in the 20s and 30s. It was the end of the European balance of power, the balance of power in the world that was focused on Europe, in the sense that from thenceforward, the United States played a critical role in the balance. And this wasn't fully seen in the 1920s. Sometimes chickens run around when their heads have been cut off for a while, but eventually it became very clear. And the final act really was World War II, which some people would argue is a continuation, completion of World War I. But what it did was end the center of the world being based in Europe. How could such a thing happen? Such an extraordinary, dramatic change. Let me quote from Prince von Bülow, who was a chancellor who had called on his successor, Bethmann Hollweg, in the Chancellor's Palace in Berlin early in August 1914. And this is von Bülow's description of what he saw when he called on Bethmann Hollweg, the German Chancellor. Bethmann stood in the center of the room. Shall I ever forget his face? There's a picture by some celebrated English painter which shows the wretched scapegoat with a look of ineffable anguish in his eyes. Such pain as I now saw in Bethmann's. For an instant we neither of us spoke. At last I said to him, "Well, tell me at least how it all happened." He raised his long, thin arms to heaven and answered in a dull, exhausted voice, "Oh, if I only knew." In many later polemics of war guilt, I often wished it had been possible to produce a snapshot of Bethmann Hollweg at the moment he said those words. Such a photograph would have been the best proof that this wretched man had never wanted war. So that's the view from the point of view of the individual who had brought Germany into the war. Now, if we step back from that and ask what caused it, and we go back to our three different images, the level of the individual, or of the type of society, or of the international system, we argued on the basis of parsimony to start with the simplest explanation, and that would be system. And that's what we'll do, though I should warn you that parsimony can also sometimes be misleading. Probably the most parsimonious explanation of World War I that I've come across is Woody Allen's in the movie Zelig, in which he says the answer is easy. Britain owned the world and Germany wanted it. Not bad, but a little bit too parsimonious. Let's turn then to our structural explanations. Remember, we argued that the unification of Germany in 1870 was important. But then we still have the problem of explaining why it took 40 more years before the war actually broke out. So I think what one really wants to look at is the rise in German power and the increased rigidity in the alliance systems. There's the two big changes at the structural level. Germany passed Britain in heavy industry at the end of the 19th century. They were about equal in 1890. And in the 20th century, the early 20th century, Germany's industrial growth rate was double that of Britain. So that whereas Britain in 1860 had been 25% of world industrial production, by 1913, it was 10%, and Germany was 15%. In addition to that, you had Germany's expansion or use of this industrial strength for a naval program, which challenged Britain in terms of Britain's mastery of the seas. And Britain began to worry about becoming isolated and how it was going to defend its empire against this growing German strength, which was not only growing at home, but beginning to expand in its overseas ambitions. And it felt that it couldn't do this alone, and that it mustn't allow Germany or any one power to dominate the continent. Sir Eyre Crowe, who was the permanent secretary of the British Foreign Office, the top civil servant, wrote a memo on the first day of January of 1907, in which he said, "German policy is extraordinarily vague and confused, but the British response assumes almost the form of a law of nature." What better expression could you ask for of a policy of balance of power? That Britain must, under all costs, not allow one country to dominate the continent of Europe. So in that sense, the British response to this rise in German power contributes to the second structural cause, which is the increasing rigidity in the alliance system in Europe. Britain leaves its isolation as an island balancer off the continent of Europe. In 1904, forms an entente with France. And then in 1907, the year of Eyre Crowe's memorandum, that's expanded to a triple entente of France, Russia, and Britain. Germany, seeing this entente of France, Britain, and Russia, begins to feel encircled. So the Germans essentially tighten their reliance on Austria-Hungary, the strong ally or the closest ally they have. So instead of flexibility where alliance patterns can shift in the form that Bismarck had wanted, you find that the two alliances become polar. They become tighter in among themselves, less prospect for shifting between them. Now, those are changes in the structure of the international system of the onset of World War I. What about changes in the process of the system? Well, as the structural shift toward bipolarity increases, this affects the process of how the game is played and reduces the degree of moderation in the process. And there are several causes. One is the increase in nationalism. What you find in the Balkans, in the eastern part of Europe, is a new Slavic nationalism which tries to have a pan-Slavism of unifying or helping Slavic peoples across national borders. And this is a great threat to two empires, the Turkish Empire, which is declining in the east and in the Balkans, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which includes a number of Slavic peoples within the empire. And in addition to that, you have the type of Darwinian or social Darwinian gloss on nationalism, which leads to German hatred of Slavs and talk about Teutonic Slavic battles that are inevitable, an ideology, if you want, of almost a racist nationalism. And that nationalism proves stronger than the tight family ties among the monarchs. It's worth remembering that the Kaiser and the Tsar were cousins. And indeed, the Kaiser thought that the Tsar would see the assassination of Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary his way as a fellow monarch. I mean, this assassination in Sarajevo of the Austrian prince, which was Archduke, which was the triggering event of the war, was an affront to all monarchs. And so the Kaiser thought that this means the Russians will come in on our side as strict monarchists. In addition to this, there was also a complacency about peace. There had been peace in Europe for 40 years since the Franco-Prussian War in terms of wars among the great powers. The crises that had occurred had been mastered, and there was a feeling that on the end or after the mastery of these crises, though, but why was it that my side backed down? Why didn't I get more out of it? There had been a crisis in Bosnia in the Balkans in 1908 in which the Russians had backed down, and the feeling was, well, not again, that's too much. And there began to be a feeling that maybe the next thing was to have a war rather than a crisis. And it was generally believed that a long war would be impossible, And so at the next time, maybe a good, sharp, short war would be a good idea, sort of like a thunderstorm clears the air. So a complacency about peace. And the third thing that was eroding the moderation of the process of the international system was German policy. We've already looked at the clumsiness of German policy, the world ambition that managed to antagonize everyone at the same time. The opposite of the way Bismarck had played his hand, or the German hand, in the 1860s through 1890. And the Germans, when they antagonized the British on the naval power, antagonized or clashed with Russia over Turkey and the Balkans, or with the French over Morocco, basically had an effect of producing an alliance against them, which then made them in turn feel encircled, which made the whole system much less moderate in terms of balance of power politics. So at the systemic level, we saw changes in the structure and process of the balance of power that made war somewhat more likely. How about the domestic level, going to what we called image 2, or what happens inside the countries? Well, at the domestic level, I can at least give you one explanation which can be quickly rejected. And that's the explanation on which Lenin made his fame as a writer, which said that it's finance capitalism inside the capitalist states which caused the wars. And the trouble with that is Lenin's theory was that the war would come from imperialism and conflicts on the peripheries. It didn't. It came at the center. And the other is perhaps more important, that the capitalists resisted the war. The bankers basically lobbied against war. It would have a terrible effect on business. Indeed, Sir Edward Grey worried about the City of London, the financial center, and its resistance to the idea of going to war. So I don't think the Leninist explanation has held up very well. But there are two more serious explanations related to the internal politics or internal nature of these societies, which are more important. The first was the internal crisis of the Austro-Hungarian and Turkish empires. Both of these were multinational empires, which were threatened by this rise of nationalism. In addition, Turkey was very weak and corrupt, so it was an easy target for nationalists in the Balkans. And essentially in 1912, in a Balkan war, Turkey was pushed out. And that just whetted the appetite of the Balkan nationalists to do the same to Austria, to push Austria out. And Serbia had the aspiration of leading this move of pushing Austria out of the Slavic areas of the Balkans. So Austria felt under considerable pressure. It feared disintegration, and with disintegration, a loss of status. So after Franz Ferdinand was assassinated at Sarajevo, Austria issued an ultimatum to Serbia, not because of the assassination. Ironically, Franz Ferdinand was not very popular with the conservatives who controlled the Austrian government. They issued the ultimatum because it was an excuse to destroy Serbia as a magnet for the South Slavs. And the best illustration of this is the views of General Conrad, who was the chief of staff of the Austro-Hungarian army. And his statement was as follows, his explanation. He said, "For this reason, and not as vengeance for the assassination, Austria-Hungary must draw the sword against Serbia. The monarchy has been seized by the throat and has to choose between allowing itself to be strangled and making a last effort to prevent its destruction." So nationalism and the internal crises of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The second domestic factor, which is of great importance, was domestic politics inside Germany. Now, there's a long literature, many books written on both sides of this, associated with a German historian named Fritz Fischer, who argued that it really was domestic politics in Germany which was primarily responsible for the war. And his argument is that the war came because of Germany's efforts at achieving hegemony over Europe, and that that effort really came from the nature of the undemocratic politics of Germany. He argued that Germany was a domestic coalition of aristocrats, the Prussian Junkers, the landed classes who grew wheat or rye, and some large capitalists who controlled the steel mills, the shipbuilding yards, and so forth. This was often called the alliance of iron and rye. Not a fully democratic politics, if you want, a log-roll situation between two large, powerful interest groups, and that they both had an interest in diverting attention abroad, of getting Germany to have a more active foreign policy. It was one way to resist social democrats, to sort of divert the attention away from domestic issues to overseas issues and resolve domestic differences by expansionism. Now, that explanation has been contested, argued about. There's something in it. It's not sufficient to explain the situation, but it does help to explain the pressure that Germany put on the international system. And finally, we can look at the first image, or the first level of analysis, the role of individuals. And what you find on the eve of World War I is an extraordinary mediocrity of leadership in all the major states. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, Franz Joseph, was a tired old man. He was putty in the hands of General Conrad and Count Berchtold, the duplicitous foreign minister. And ironically, Franz Ferdinand, the man who was assassinated at Sarajevo, had been one of the liberals in the empire who had had a restraining effect on the old man. In Russia, Tsar Nicholas was an isolated autocrat, resisting change at home, surrounded by incompetent foreign and defense ministers, influenced by a wife and the infamous monk Rasputin, who ironically was a pacific force on this specific issue, but was out of the picture because he'd been stabbed by a prostitute. But most of all, at the level of individuals, one has to focus on Kaiser Wilhelm. Kaiser Wilhelm was a blusterer, a man with a sense of inferiority, a weak and emotional man who led Germany into a risky policy without any skill or consistency. A good illustration of this, again, comes from Prince von Bülow, who I gave you Bülow's portrait of Bateman Hallweg. Let me give you Bülow's portrait of the Kaiser. It says, William II did not want war, he feared it. His bellicose notes proved nothing. His more menacing jingo speeches were intended to give the foreigner the impression that here was another Frederick the Great or Napoleon. William didn't want war, if only because he did not trust his nerves not to give way under the strain of any really critical situation. Or, if you want to go to the Kaiser's own reactions against his cousin, Edward VII, the King of England, Kaiser, now I'm quoting the Kaiser, Edward VII in the grave is still stronger than I who am alive, and to think that there have been people who believed England could be won over and pacified by this or that petty measure. Now this whole trickery must be ruthlessly exposed and the mask of Christian pacifism roughly and publicly torn from the face of Britain and the pharisaical peace sham put in the pillory. And our consuls in Turkey and India, agents and so forth, must fire the whole Mohammedan world to fierce revolt against this hateful, lying, unprincipled nation of shopkeepers. For if we are to bleed to death, England will at least lose India. That gives you a picture of the mind of the Kaiser on the eve of the war. Now, in that sense, then, we find that personality does play a role, in the sense that with leaders like that, war becomes even more likely. It's not clear that war could have been avoided, but with that quality of leadership, its probability greatly increases. Now, some of you might say, look, if you have explanations at the systemic level, at the domestic society level, and at the individual level, then this thing was inevitable. And with so many causes, it must indeed look inevitable. Sometimes when we have things with many causes, we call it an overdetermined event. Several of those causes might have been sufficient in and of themselves. But should we say that World War I was inevitable? To my view, not until it actually broke out. And even then, it's not clear what kind of war was inevitable. Let me try to explain that by sorting out three different types of causes. As we think of causation of anything, not just war, you can talk about deep causes, intermediate causes, and precipitating causes. And it's analogous to, let's say, turning on the lights in this auditorium. The precipitating cause was somebody flipped a switch. The intermediate cause is somebody wired the electrical system. The deep cause is that electricity was discovered. Or if you want to switch to a more homely metaphor, look at fire in a fireplace. You could say that striking a match is the precipitating cause, having the kindling in place is a intermediate cause, and somebody putting the logs there is a deeper cause. In that sense, if we look at World War I in terms of those three types of causes, you could say that the deep causes of World War I were structural and to some extent domestic. At the structural level, it was German strength and the loss of flexibility in the alliances. And at the domestic level, it was the rise of nationalism and the fundamental imbalances in German politics. At the intermediate level, the process issues and the personal issues come in. German policy, the complacency, the nature of the leaders. And of course, the precipitating cause was a terrorist action, the famous assassination of the Archduke at Sarajevo. Now, looking backward, all that seems like it must therefore be inevitable. If it had not been for the assassination of Sarajevo, then there might have been some other incident that would have happened. Indeed, it had almost occurred, the war had almost broken out in 1912. Or another way of putting it, if not this match, why not some other to light the fire? Now, how do we test such arguments? Well, one of the things we do is engage in what's sometimes called counterfactual history, which is a big word for a simple proposition about something we do all the time anyway, which is to ask, what if? What might have been? And to try to develop careful arguments about what might have been. What if there'd been no Sarajevo, for example? Well, there's a question of probability here. Given other factors, the probability was high, but not inevitable that something else would have come along. To go back to our homely metaphor about the logs and kindling, if logs and kindling sit for a long time and nobody comes along with a match, the stuff may get too damp to light, or it may rain before somebody comes along with a match. So the fact that a precipitating cause could trigger it doesn't mean that if something doesn't precipitate it, that it's inevitable. So one way of thinking about that applied to World War I is suppose there had been no crisis until, let's say, 1916. Suppose that nobody had come along with a Sarajevo for 2 more years. What might have happened? Well, for one thing, the Russians might have gotten stronger. And that growing strength might have deterred the Germans from thinking, as they thought with their military plan called the Schlieffen Plan, that they could accomplish a war on 2 fronts at once, with a rapid strike against France in the west and then turning to deal with the Russians to the east. In that sense, the Germans, such German military leaders as von Moltke, had begun to worry that Russia would be too strong by 1916 for Germany to beat them in war. Why? Because of those railroads that were being built. Indeed, if one looks at the situation in the 1890s, the Germans would have 2 to 3 months of a free hand against the French in the West before the Russians could really gather their troops and march them to a situation where they could be effective. By 1910, the German military staff was estimating that it was more like 10 days that they could deal with the West before they'd have to face the Russians. And the feeling was that in 1916, this would be even less. So some of the German leaders read that to say that if war is going to come with Russia, better now than later. And indeed, if somehow you'd gotten through 1914 to 1916, it's possible that the Germans might have felt deterred, that they might have felt that they couldn't pull it off to have a war on 2 fronts, or they might have altered their battle plan, the Schlieffen Plan, and decided that they would concentrate only on the east and not have a 2-front war at all. So one possibility is that the growth of Russian strength might have made a difference. Another possibility, if there had been no Sarajevo in 1914 and you'd had a few more years, is the German industrial strength could have continued to grow. Russia might have fallen into decline through corruption. Without war, it's possible that Germany could have become dominant on the continent of Europe and that Britain would have been deterred. As the British historian A.G. Taylor has argued, if there had been no World War I, Germany might indeed have won the mastery of Europe. Another kind of counterfactual is not whether there would have been some war at all, but given the German policy of antagonizing everyone at once and the fear of encirclement and the Austrian weakness in the Balkans, you could argue some war was likely, but what kind of war? In other words, let's argue that I'll grant you that something was going to happen, but did it have to become World War I as we know it? Well, it seems to me the answer to that is no. I can think of at least 4 other plausible possibilities. One might have been a local war. It could have remained largely a Balkan crisis where it started. For example, the Kaiser, as late as July 5th, expected no war. And the Kaiser wrote at that time, "I can't imagine the old gentleman," by which he referred to the Austrian Empire, "I can't imagine the old gentleman will go to war, and certainly not over Franz Ferdinand." Indeed, what many expected at that time was another diplomatic victory, such as Germany and Austria had had over the Russia in Bosnia in 1908-1909. Basically, when Germany promised full support to Austria in that crisis, the Russians had backed down. And so the feeling was, this will be another Bosnian crisis. We'll come out strengthened, we'll be ahead. Or if it's a war, it'll turn out to be an Austrian-Serbian war. Indeed, the Kaiser felt so secure in this view that on July 6th, he went for a vacation cruise. And when he came back and found how the Austrians had filled in the blank check that he'd give them of promising to support them, he tried to keep it a local war. On July 28th, he sent a telegram to his cousin, the Tsar, urging that this be kept under control as only a local war. Ironically, the telegram was addressed "Dear Nicky" and signed Willie. It didn't work, but a local war was one possibility. A second possible alternative was a one-front war. When Russia mobilized, when essentially it gave the orders to have its troops report to their stations and be put on trains and start the movement westward, Germany mobilized. But at the last minute, the Kaisers thought perhaps we could just have a one-front war, and maybe it would be possible just to have a Russian-German war and not have the Schlieffen Plan where we send all these troops to the west. And he called in von Moltke, and he asked him if we could have a one-front war, and Moltke said to him it was impossible. He said, "Your Majesty, if you tried to stop the trains in the mobilization schedule at this stage, all you'll have is a mass of disorganized men, no army." Later, General von Staab of the Railway Division of the German General Staff said indeed it would have been possible, that it was not inevitable that you had to have a two-front war. Still, a third possibility of what might have happened, what other wars could there have been besides what we call World War I, is a two-front war, but without Britain. If the Germans had not invaded Belgium and violated the neutrality of Belgium, it's plausible that and they did that, remember, because they had to move so quickly to get the French knocked out in the west so they could then turn east. It's plausible that without the violation of Belgian neutrality, the group in the British cabinet who were for war might not have been able to carry the day. The British cabinet, the Liberal government, was split. There was a strong group in opposition to the idea of going to war. It's not true that Sir Edward Grey and the Foreign Office went to war out of moral outrage at the violation of Belgian neutrality, but it is true that the violation of Belgian neutrality greatly helped their case in the internal arguments within the cabinet division. So in that sense, it was another factor that might not have had to come out the way it did. And finally, a fourth alternative war that we can imagine is a war which was constrained only to Europe, without the United States. After all, it was when the United States entered the war after 1917 that the balance within the war was finally tipped. It was still an open question up to that point as to whether Germany or the Western Britain and France would actually win the war. And the American participation turned out to be not the deciding factor, but an important tipping point at a late stage. And in that sense, one has to look again at the ineptitude of German policy. If the Germans had not had the unrestricted U-boat tax on surface civilian vessels, which was something that Bateman had urged the Navy not to do, it's possible that the Americans might have stayed out. And indeed, if the Americans had stayed out and the Russians had been knocked out in 1918, it's possible that you could have had a German victory in 1918. So in that sense, when we say that war was inevitable, we're begging a question. Maybe it wasn't inevitable, and maybe if it was war that was inevitable, it might have been a much smaller war. It's quite plausible that without one or two of these things happening, one of these accidents of history, that we could refer to not World War I, but we might be talking today, if we talked about it at all, as the Austro-Serbian War of August 1914. But that's not the way it turned out. Another way of thinking about this is using the metaphor of a funnel. Events close in over time, but the funnel can widen out again. It doesn't have to narrowly go down to the outbreak of war alone. Now, degrees of freedom are lost as things close in. We can say that the probability increases as the funnel narrows. But if the funnel opens up again, we may gain more degrees of freedom. So as we look over this period, we can argue that in 1904, the funnel began to close a bit. This was when the Franco-German Entente occurs. But there's still many more degrees of freedom. In 1907, when the British join, and it's a triple entente, and the Germans tighten their relations with Austria, it narrows down even more in terms of probability. But in 1910, Bateman-Hallweg is seeking good relations with Britain, and there's a hope that the triple entente may begin to erode from internal friction between the French, the British, and the Russians. So the funnel begins to open up again. Then it closes again with the second Moroccan crisis, in which there's a problem between Germany and France, which tends to reunite the triple entente. But the funnel widens again in 1912, when there's a renewed effort to try to have a détente between Britain and Germany. Haldane, the British diplomat, goes to Berlin. There's talk about the naval arms race have already been won by Britain, that there may be some agreements reached on the other disputes between the British and the Germans, and there's a feeling that maybe things are widening out again. Then you have the situation where the Balkan Wars occur in 1912 and 1914. Perhaps that is the funnel tightening. But the point is that there's nothing that's absolutely inevitable at any of these points. In fact, as a way of illustrating this, in the terms of the minds of the people who were most closely involved, it's worth remembering that in June of 1914, Britain sent 4 of its dreadnought battleships, which was the great new battleships, which was the key in the naval arms race between Britain and Germany, the source of such great anxiety. Britain sent 4 of these dreadnoughts to Kiel in Germany for a state visit. I mean, talk about high risks. The idea that you take 4 of your prime battleships and put them in the enemy's port if you expected war is a little bit crazy. So it's clear that they weren't expecting war because of the vulnerability. In fact, British sailors were walking arm in arm on the quay in Kiel on June 28th of 1914 when they heard news that some Serbian terrorist had shot some prince in Sarajevo. So in short, history always has its surprises. And we should not believe in inevitability as long as there is room for human choice. There are degrees of probability. There are times when situations are more and less constraining, more and less difficult. But the view that war is inevitable even with something as overdetermined as World War I, at all three of those levels of analysis, does not lead one to the point of saying it was absolutely inevitable. Now, does history have its lessons in a case like this? What can we say about the myths, if you want, of World War I and how to think about it? Well, I think you can argue that World War I, which is sometimes called the accidental war, was not really fully accidental. Austria, after all, deliberately wanted to go to war. From the Austrian point of view, war was better than decline and disintegration as a state. And Germany felt that if war was going to occur, it was better to have war now rather than later. The miscalculation was really over the length and the depth of the war. It may be that war was deliberate, but nobody wanted the war that they got. Another argument that's sometimes made is that the war was created by the arms race, that this is a perfect example of an arms race leading to war. That's too simple. It wasn't the new technology of naval arms or the race in naval armaments that led to the war. In fact, by 1912, the Germans had more or less accepted that the British had won the naval arms race between them. In some ways, you could argue that the naval arms race was over by 1912. It did, however, leave a political residue of bitterness, and essentially it had a negative effect on German-British relations, but it was primarily psychological. A different form of arms race was essentially the fear about the increased capability of Russia to mobilize its troops into a massive infantry that could move quickly. That, of course, affected the extent to which the German generals who were in favor of preventive war, a war now rather than 1916, opted for that decision. But it's hard to see that in terms of analogies to arms races that we often use in the modern period. So it's true that the buildup of armaments affected the length and depth of the war, but it's a little bit too simple to say that arms races, such as the arms races that occurred in the period before 1914, were the direct cause of the war. Now, there are some other warnings, though, that I think are valid lessons from World War I. One is the importance, in terms of judging the balance of power, at looking at both structure and process, that moderation comes from the process, and that strength alone is not enough to judge what will be the stability of a particular balance of power. It was not simply the fact of the Germans' strength, but the fact of this loss of moderation in the process that seems to me particularly critical in that period. A second valid lesson is the danger of great power crises, of allowing great powers to become too closely enmeshed, too eyeball to eyeball, if you like, particularly if there's a possibility of complacency. The danger is that a great power crisis, people think, will work out the way the last great power crisis worked out. 1914 was supposed to be a repeat of 1908, though ironically, von Bülow, who I've quoted several times in his portrait of Bethmann-Hollweg, had earlier warned Bethmann-Hollweg, don't try to repeat my success in the Bosnian crisis. It won't come out the same way the next time. But Bethmann-Hollweg ignored that advice. So in that sense, one should beware of faith in limited wars. Wars involve surprises and don't always stay as limited as they're intended to be. And a third valid warning or lesson from World War I seems to me that the question of stability in a time of crisis is to have forces that don't need to be used, that can be held in reserve, where there's no danger of using them or losing them. Or if you want to have forces where you don't have the kind of situation that you had in 1914 with the railway mobilization schedules, where the fear is that if you try to interfere with the process once it's started, that you'll lose control and lose your capabilities. It's interesting to note that Barbara Tuchman, the historian, wrote a fine popular history of World War I entitled The Guns of August, which is still very readable to this day. And one of the people who read that book and was enormously influenced by it was John F. Kennedy. And he read it and referred to it, according to his brother Robert Kennedy, at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and was acutely aware of the danger that complex military systems, if they got out of control, could constrain decisions which would bring about outcomes totally different from what was intended. As Kennedy put it, there was no desire to see the missiles of October reproducing the guns of August. So in that sense, perhaps history did make a difference. It made a difference because of who it was that read it. But I would say, in concluding about World War I, that the other point that's extremely important is to realize the dangers of attitudes of complacency or ideology that accept war and don't pay enough attention to the dangers and surprises that are involved in war. There's an interesting quotation from Winston Churchill which sums it up. It's a way to try to portray the mood that people had in 1914, in August 1914, on the eve of the war. In a sense, there was something of an ideology or a view that might be summarized as a fatalism, that this war was inevitable, it was going to come, better to get it over, a good sharp shower or thunderstorm will clear the air, that it was right that under social Darwinism the strong would prevail, better to let the strong prevail, let's have a war in which we'll prove who's on top, and that it suited the interests of the powers that were in control of the various states. Churchill, in summarizing this mood in his book, The World Crisis, 1911 to 1914, says the following: "There was a strange temper in the air. Unsatisfied by material prosperity, the nations turned fiercely toward strife, internal or external. National passions, unduly exalted in the decline of religion, burned beneath the surface of nearly every land with fierce if shrouded fires. Almost one might think the world wished to suffer. Certainly men everywhere were eager to dare. They did indeed dare, and they lost. And perhaps that's the ultimate lesson of 1914.